All right. How's everybody doing today? Feels like feels like spring outside. It's getting nice. I like it. All right. So, what we're gonna do today? Well, actually, let's talk about let's go on announcements here. So, as far as announcements go, yeah, obviously, I'm once again late getting this homework up. I apologize for this homework disconnect right now. What's going on with this is basically last year was the first time I taught this class, and so I built out the class, first time around. And then this year I changed up the order on which we're doing some of the stuff. And so the problem is all the homeworks are getting out of sync, and it makes it really, you can't just change the homeworks. It's like you can't move questions from one homework to the other, and it is a major effort to switch these around. What Once I get it switched around, it won't be so bad like going forward after the semester. But right now it's a really confusing, difficult thing. And so really have to just dedicate the time to do that. And I apologize that I haven't been doing a better job of that, but it's I'll get it up, and I'll let you know what's going on. So on that note, though, we do have I guess we're gonna have a midterm coming up in a couple weeks, and so I guess I don't know exactly when it is, but I imagine it's in a couple weeks. It feels like it's coming up, getting closer to the middle of the semester. So um, I'll address that, I think, starting next week, and we'll do a full review. And just as a heads up, it's basically it's going to be an online, just like everything else, but it's going to be a timed one, and you get one attempt on it. So, um, kind of like in a traditional kind of like test taking format. So, just be a heads up on that. But I'll give you more. I'll give you plenty of heads up, more announcements next week, getting ready for it for the following week. I think that's what's going on. Yeah, that's all I really have right now in terms of announcements. So, what we're doing today, though, is we're going to be wrapping up the chapter. I don't know which chapter is it. Chapter 5 that we're working on. I can't remember the chapter numbers, but so this is going to be on the hearing, speech, noise section, music and noise section. So we're finishing on that one up today. And the next class, what we do is we're going to do reflection, and I think if we can get to it, we're going to do diffraction. So we're actually going to do 2 chapters next class, but they're short ones because the concepts are pretty straightforward. So, but that's the plan for next class. So we should be like rocking and rolling. Yeah, because right now, I guess one of the reasons that's kind of confusing is because we're spanning a chapter over it's the end of one week and the start of the next week, and so it's kind of confusing. But starting after this class, it should get all synced up, and we should be all good. But yeah, so what we're doing today is, and actually what we're doing is we are crushing what what I think is like an entire semester's worth of material. So we talk about like music, string winds, percussion basics. I mean, this is literally a half a semester of study if we want to get into that. And they literally put it into one paragraph of each of these in the book. And that paragraph is only like a small paragraph. It's not even a big one. But that's because this is a class on acoustics, not on what we call musical acoustics. So if you've taken this class, like what was the Physics 3620, physics of music and sound, which is what I used to teach. We spent like half the semester on strings, wind, and percussion instruments, and just deconstructing all of them and talking about the physics of all those. And it's fascinating. It's really cool. So, but we're not really going to have time to go through that. So we're going to kind of blast through that stuff today. But I would encourage you that if you want to learn more about this stuff, I'm only going to talk like really quickly about this stuff. But I think it's fascinating when you start getting into it. I'm going to inject some of the old stuff that I have in there, just because I think there's some neat trivia that kind of like attaches. Because we're all in the music. Well, most of us are in the music program here, so we have an attachment to music. But we're not really going to talk about music in particular for this class, just because it's kind of outside of the context for this. So, we'll talk about the dynamic range of voice and music and auditory area of speech and music, and then talk about noise. Like, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about pink noise and distortion, and like what distortion really is. We'll talk more about that also in next semester in critical listening. When we get to that, we'll talk about like noise and just actually we talk a lot about distortion, not a ton, but a fair amount about distortion and how to hear it, what does it sound like, and what it is. We all know what distortion means, but what does it actually mean in terms of sound and that sort of thing? So, um, cool. Okay. Cool. So, let's talk about music. Well, I mean, music is weird. Like we think about like we think about music as just being like we just don't even notice it most of the time what music is. And it's just strange to think about like what it is. So like we've been talking about this whole idea of what sound is up to this point. And sound makes, I'm hoping, makes some sense, but music is strange. Like music is this idea of what we do is we take certain frequencies and we take certain sounds and we put them in time with a certain length and a certain loudness, and what for whatever reason it creates an emotional responsiveness, which is strange. I mean, like if you were an alien coming down to Earth and you saw these people playing their instruments, you'd be like, "This is weird." It's just like music is a very strange thing just as a concept. That like we're the only species on the planet that really has it. I mean, we look at, you watch the like parrots and stuff bob their heads, and like you see the cockatoos doing some death metal head banging, and then you'll see occasionally things like some of those like memes or whatever videos of like cows come running because the guy's playing a trombone, or somebody playing their acoustic guitar for an elephant and they sway. And you can say that they probably appreciate it, but not in the same way that humans appreciate music. Music is just a strange concept overall. But and so like I think it's just it's kind of fun to step back and think about like what it is. It's just kind of, it's this weird concept. But we'll talk more about that kind of that concept in critical listening. But what we want to do is like talk about like, okay, so let's talk about the instruments that we're going to use to create these tones and these beats and these sounds that influence us. So so we're going to talk about this just real quickly here on string instruments. So when we talk about string instruments, obviously the defining characteristics is going to be a string, right? So like we talk about just in terms of a string. And if you play guitar or a violin or even a piano, like you have this like kind of intuitive concept of what a string instrument and how it works. But what's a little bit interesting is when we start talking about the physics behind these things and how they kind of correlate. So when we talk about like string instruments, we talk about like a bowed, like a classical instruments, like, violin, viola, bass, cello, that sort of stuff. We talk about plucks, like banjo, guitar, mandolin, sitar. Like, I mean, there's some other ones in there. And then, but let's think about like the strings themselves. And because this will actually kind of tie into what we're talking about when we think about the way a string vibrates. So what we do is well, actually, let's just talk about this in terms of physics for a second, what's going on with transduction. So what we're doing is we're adding energy to the system. So the energy, like in terms of physics goes, we're gonna play a string instrument here. And what I do is like I'm adding energy into the system, so I'm gonna excite the string. And that string is going to set up into resonance. And again, this is something we know intuitively, that it's based off of the string thickness, or what we call the mass per unit length. So it's how fat the string is, like how thick and heavy the string is, how long the string is, and how tight the string is. Those are kind of our three factors that we have in determining what the vibrational resonant or frequency of the string is going to be. And when we set this thing in vibration, it's gonna vibrate. And you think about it, it's gonna move kind of like, well, it's gonna look like this, right? So we call this our modes of oscillation. So, and what we've got here is that if the string is vibrating, it's going to be going up and down and up and down. It's going to be like vibrating like this. But not only is it going to be doing that, it's also going to be vibrating right here. And like, I guess I should have a video of this, but basically we can think about the first mode of oscillation is going like this. The second mode of oscillation is like, this one is up while this one is down, and this one is up while this one is down. So it's moving in opposite. And then we see that we have our third mode of oscillation right here, and our fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh modes of oscillation right here. And these are also, it turns out, happen to be our harmonics. So when we talk about string instruments, by and large, the harmonics are integer multiples of the fundamental. That's one of the defining characteristics of it. So what I mean by that is, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, we did this even when we were talking about last class last class with human voice, is that my voice has all these harmonics. So those harmonics are multiples of the fundamental. So when I say the integer multiples of the fundamental, what I'm saying there is that say we have this one vibrating at 100 hertz. Well, this one's going to vibrate at 200 hertz and 300 hertz, 400, 500, 600, 700. In fact, if we look at this, we can imagine this for just a moment here. If a wavelength, like a full wavelength is like, it's going to be from where it goes from top or from middle to top to middle to bottom to middle again. So that's one full wavelength. So in this case right here, if I were to map this out right here, I have 1/2 of a wavelength right here. Just looking at the top one. because what we're doing, it's important to understand that what we're looking at is two different states here. The string is moving up and down like this. So this is just showing it that they're showing it at its maximum up and its maximum down right there. And if you were to take like what's really fun is to take a strobe light and excite this thing, and you can watch this thing moving like either in slow motion. It's pretty cool. But what we see here is that it's up here at one point and down here. But we're just saying right here, if we look at this and it's bound right here because the string is bound, that it's going to be pushed, go up here and down here and over here. So it's basically, this is 1/2 of a wavelength. And if we look at this one right here, if I were to map this one, it goes right up here, down here, and back up here. And so this is one full wavelength here. This is 1/2 of a wavelength. Well, we know that wavelength and frequency are correlated. And so what we can say is that half the wavelength is, like twice the wavelength is half the frequency. V equals F lambda. I wish I don't have my iPad in here. But basically what we're saying here is that this wavelength is twice the wavelength of this one right here. So therefore that this wavelength is twice as this one. So therefore this frequency is half of this one. So this frequency is double this one. This one, we can see that we have 1.5 wavelengths right here. And this is 1/2 of a wavelength. So this is this is 3 times the frequency. And 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, and 7 times. So what we can say there, like, and I don't want to dwell on that too much. That we can spend a lot of time, and like honestly, in the past I've done a lot of homework questions on that, but we're not going to really spend that much time on this one. The important thing to here remember is that it's integer multiples of the fundamental, and that these harmonics. So this first mode, second mode, third mode, fourth mode, fifth mode, and sixth mode, we can also say that these are the harmonics. So this is the fundamental, first harmonic, second harmonic, third, fourth, ... So what we're saying here is that all the that they're integer multiples. And so when I pluck a guitar string, for instance, it's actually playing all of these. Where is my acoustic? This may be worth it. This may be worth. Let me do it. This is worth it. My acoustic's right here. It's in a case though. I gotta get it out of the case. It's probably wildly out of tune, but that's okay. Good enough for what we're doing for today. I only need one string. But I do need headphones, so I can hear what I'm doing. Okay. So when I pluck the string, and let me do this. I'm gonna go to, let's actually, let's do this. Let's do a recording and let's look at it, because I think this is pretty interesting to think about. So when I play my string here, I'm plucking it by adding energy. So I'm adding energy into the system right here. And what it's doing is it's vibrating back and forth. But what may not be the most obvious thing is it's actually vibrating at all of those frequencies at the same time. So what it's doing is when I set the string into vibration, and if you watch, like, it's pretty fun if you go to like YouTube and watch some of the slow-mo videos of strings, it's pretty cool. But we can see that this one's going to be going up and down, but it's also going to be vibrating this in this mode, and this mode, and this mode, and this mode, and this mode. They're all vibrating at the same time. So it's a little strange to think about that, but they're actually all happening. We can prove that too, just if I were to record this. Do recording. So we can see my plucking of it, and if I zoom in on it right here, you can see that it's looking like it's oscillating. We can see that it's vibrating back and forth here, but we're seeing that it's not a sine wave, right? A sine wave would be one frequency. So if I look at the spectrogram on this thing, and let's go like this. Make it a little bit bigger. We can see that this one right here, this one might be a ghosty one right there. Let's do this. We see all the harmonics right here. So these are all the harmonics that are playing, and we can see them actually happening right here as well. Delete that. So those are the harmonics that we're seeing right there, and those are the same harmonics that we're seeing right there. So what they're doing is they're vibrating at different amplitudes, of course. And like if I plug this thing in the middle, depending on where I pluck the string, it's going to excite different amounts of harmonics there. So what we're seeing is essentially that this string is vibrating at all these different modes at the same time. And the amplitudes of those are going to be relatively different from one another, and that's what's going to give rise to timbre. So once again, timbre is relative amplitudes of the harmonics. There's more to it, but that's basically what we're saying there. So the string is moving up and down right here, and then what it's doing is it's actually getting tighter. It's kind of neat to think about how a string instrument works. Is the string is getting tighter and looser, because when it goes up here, it's getting really tight, and then it gets looser, and then it gets tighter as it goes over here. The result is it pulls on this bridge right here. And so the bridge is actually getting tighter and looser, tighter and looser, tighter and looser. And this is for all string, for all string instruments. Then it goes to this body, the face of the instrument. So the face of the instrument is what's pushing and pulling on the air. And so that's what's acting as a speaker. So we have this vibrational energy that's getting pushed into acoustic energy, and we call that that change of energy we call that transduction. So we're transducing the vibrational energy of the string into acoustic energy, pushing and pulling on the face of the guitar. And the way the guitar is built, and I'm using guitar as general, but I'm just saying it could be the same thing for a cello or bass or sitar or any of these kind of instruments. That the way the manufacturer or designer built that, so that we want it to have to be loose so that it can move back and forth, but tight enough to resist the tension of the strings. That the manner in which they do that, the wood they would do that, the body that has these resonance is going to have the influence on it. They're all going to give rise to a different kind of quality of sound, and even the strings. So when you think about like a nylon string guitar versus say a metal, not all nylons, but metal string guitar versus like a nylon string guitar, they're going to have different qualities of sound to them, and that is a result of because these different harmonics are going to give rise to all these kind of little subtle things that are in play right there. So let's talk real quick about bowed strings. Now this isn't in the book. This is just something I think is kind of like some quick interesting trivia right here. But if we think about how a bowed string works, so what we do is we take some horsehair on a bow, and we put a bunch of rosin on it right there to make it sticky. And what happens is this is the bow right here. Like if you can imagine looking either down or on, looking up on the bottom of the bow. What it's doing here is this. The restoring force. Actually, I have this. Yeah. The force of friction is going to be this. I've got my arrow in the wrong direction right here. But what we're doing is we put the bow on the string right here. As it drags, it stretches the string out, and because it grabs, it's all sticky, and because we have all that rosin on the bow, we're dragging that up there, and then at some point it's going to get too tight, and therefore the frictional force, the restoring force is going to get greater than the frictional force, and it's going to let go and snap, and it's going to go it's going to grip, slip, grip, slip, grip, slip. And the result is what we end up with is something that looks like this. It's going to be displacement. So it's going to be gripping, slipping, gripping, slipping, and so on and so forth. And we can imagine though that this, if we look at that wave shape right there, that's like near a sawtooth. It's not quite a sawtooth, but it's getting close to a sawtooth. And we know that a sawtooth wave is going to be much brighter and much harsher than, say, a sine wave. And so that's what gives rise to the timbre of, say, a bowed like a violin. So a violin it's beautiful sounding. It can get screechy, but it's beautiful sounding. And the part of the reason it's so beautiful is because of this business right here. This sawtooth wave gives such rich harmonics that gives that really like a harsh sound. But I mean, like, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean harsh, like it's a bright, edgy sound, and that's what bowed instruments have, that quality of sound to them. Compared to, say, when you hear somebody do pizzicato on a bowed instrument, it has that plucky sound. The sustain isn't very long, but it's got that kind of warmer sound to it, and you might call this one a harsher sound to it. And so it's just interesting to see that we're starting to see that there's this relationship between how the instrument works, and that gives rise to the wave shape, which in turn is gives rise to the harmonics, which is what we perceive as timbre. So I think what's interesting with this is when you start to like look at an instrument, and where this comes to, like, important for us as audio production, as audio engineers, is when you start to appreciate how an instrument is vibrating and working. will give rise to an understanding of how the physics works, which also informs you what microphone you should use and microphone placement and how this will sit in the mix and all these other kind of things. So they like, even though this seems like kind of like cool little maybe trivia, it actually informs how you're actually going to you use your mic technique and your mixing technique and your EQ technique. All the stuff, it all kind of folds into the same thing. It's kind of cool, kind of interesting stuff there. So anyway, we call this the slip and grip. This is the same thing like if you take your finger and you put it along the top of a wine glass and you run around there, you can feel it on your finger actually going whoo. That you can actually feel the slipping and the gripping right there. Or like screeching tires will do this, on a skidding tire will do this as well. So that slip and grip is kind of cool little bit of trivia right there. So, and this is also just a little bit more like, it's a little bit more extra trivia here. I just want to talk real quick about like how strings vibrate in like the electric guitar. So I was just showing you with the acoustic guitar. With an electric guitar, we have the same concept where we have these strings are going to be vibrating. But instead of using the transduction isn't going to be the face of the instrument moving back and forth, it's going to be we're going to use pickups right here. And we could go on and on and on about the physics of pickups are fascinating. It's really cool. Using Faraday's law, but we're not really going to go into that right now. But what I do want to focus on here for just a moment is like these pickups. So the pickups are like the placements of the pickups. So the placement of the pickup really does determine the sound. So if you think about, well, okay, guitarists out there, what's the difference between the bridge pickup and the neck pickup? Bridge pickup and neck pickup, like tonal wise. Come on, we have a ton of guitarists in this class. Yeah. Yeah, so the neck pickup sounds a bit more warm. And then the bridge, so this is the neck pickup right here because it's closer to the neck of the guitar. This is the bridge pickup because this is the bridge of the guitar right here. So the bridge on an acoustic guitar or like a violin or again any kind of stringed instrument, the bridge is what the kind of the transducer. That's what translates the vibrational energy into the body of the instrument. But for this one, we don't play it. And you can play an electric guitar without plugged in, but it's just really quiet, right? Because the energy is not being transduced into here. But what we are going to do is we're going to use these pickups, and the pickups are going to sense the magnetic field they're going to warp the magnetic field by the string. The string is going to warp the magnetic field. That there's magnets in these things, in the pickups, permanent magnets that create a magnetic field, and the string is going to warp that magnetic field. So if we look at something like this, so here's where we go. So like we have our bridge right here, string, and then we have our pickup, and these red lines are going to just be the magnetic field. And this vibrational string is going to like vibrate and it's going to create an induction of like, it's going to induce electricity to go in one direction and the other on the wires coming off of this. And then what we do is we just hook that up to an amplifier and voila, we have sound. So we're relying on electricity to actually boost the sound and then push that sound out. But what's interesting is where we place these pickups. So if I were to take the pickups right here, now we don't do this, but if I were to put the pickup in the middle, like say at the 12th fret, the middle of the guitar, it would pick up a lot of the first mode of oscillation, and then it would pick up none of the second mode of oscillation, and would pick up a lot of the third mode of oscillation. So if I were to do this one right here, it would really pick up a lot of the first, actually it would only pick up the odd modes of the odd harmonics. And it would be really, really, really bassy sounding because this one is going to be the lowest. This is going to be 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, all the harmonics. But because this one has the biggest amplitude, it's going to be the most prominent, and it's going to be very, very, very loud, and which results in a very warm tone. The more higher harmonics, the brighter the sound. The more lower harmonics, the warmer the sound. So, or like you could say colder and warmer, or you could say brighter and darker. So like what we're correlating here is these timbral descriptors. When I say dark, if it's got a dark tone to it, what I mean is that it has a lot more prominent of the amplitudes of the lower modes of oscillation are going to be more prominent than the upper modes. And if I can say something's very bright or something's very harsh, it's going to say that there's going to be a lot of relative upper harmonics. So, and that's why when we say like the violin has that sawtooth wave, it's going to give rise to something that's very bright sounding because it has a lot of upper harmonics. Well, what we want to do is we can decide where we want to put this pickup right here. So if I move the pickup over towards the bridge right here. So if this is the bridge and then this is the neck, we look at this right here and we can see that this one is going to be picking up more of the first mode of oscillation. This one's going to be picking up less of the first mode of oscillation. Therefore, the first mode is going to, this pickup is going to sound warmer because it's going to pick up more of the lower modes of oscillation. And if we look at the 7th and 10th mode of oscillation right here, we can see that it's at near what we call an antinode, where it's the biggest mode of like vibration here. And of course, these are going to be all over the place. These modes are going to be moving all over the place. These nodes and antinodes right here are going to be changing based off of which harmonic you're on right there. But in general, what we can say is that because this neck pickup, this is the neck and this is the bridge pickup, that the neck pickup is closer to the neck, so therefore it's going to pick up more of these first and even second and sometimes even third mode of oscillation compared to what this one is going to get. And therefore, this one is going to get fairly bright sounding and this one's going to be fairly warm sounding. Cool. That's just a cool little trivia right there. Where we're connecting some physics and some guitar, like some guitar work. So, and the same thing goes true, of course, with, you can put pickups on any bowed instrument or like on any string instrument. So you can put them on like a bowed, like a violin. You have electric violins, you have electric banjos, you have electric, all these kind of instruments. You really don't, like, with the banjo, you don't really do electric banjos. I'm sure you could do it, but you don't usually do an electric banjo. But like an electric mandolin or, I don't know, I'm trying to think of other like stringed instruments, but you can pretty much throw a pickup on almost any of those instruments right there. So that's just a little bit, that one's not really part of any homework. That's not in the book or anything like that. I just thought it was kind of cool little trivia because I think that stuff is really cool. So, all right, let's talk real quick just in terms of wind instruments. So wind instruments, we're going to kind of divide those up into woodwinds and brass and other use forced breath. So it's considered a one-dimensional open and closed pipe. And when we say open and closed pipe, what we mean is that they're either open at both ends or closed at one end. And those result in they have a lot to do with how the harmonics work there. So closed pipes have mostly odd multiples of the fundamental, and open pipes have all the harmonics. So when I say like I would say odd and even multiples of the fundamental of the harmonic series there. So, but what we do is, in truth, though, what we do is we actually modify these instruments so that even the woodwinds, like woodwinds tend to be closed at one end. Actually, well, if you think about it, like say a trumpet. So if I hold a trumpet out to my mouth, you would say, well, it's actually a pipe closed at one end because I'm closing off with my mouth and I've got the whole horn and then it goes out the bell. And it harmonically, if I didn't have the bell on there and if I didn't do some special magic tricks with the mouthpiece, it would have only the odd harmonics. But the bell and the mouthpiece pull some magic tricks and basically make it so it has all the harmonics in there. And same thing goes with like say an oboe or a flute. Flute actually is a pipe open at both ends because you're just blowing across the flute right there. You're just blowing across the top of it, and you've got all your fingers there that are opening up the openings there, and so it's actually acting as a pipe closed or open at both ends. So therefore, open pipes have all the harmonics. So the only really weird one is pretty much the clarinet. The clarinet is an unusual instrument. Well, actually, we'll talk about that in a minute. We'll get to that here in just a second there. So let's talk about brass for a second. So brass is physically pipe closed at one end, but harmonically behaves like an open pipe. So flaring of the bell brings the lower harmonics up, and the mouthpiece brings the upper harmonics down, and therefore giving it integer multiples of the fundamental. So the result is that it has all the harmonics. And so it's really important that what we want to have happen is that we want to have the harmonics be integer multiples of the fundamental. Otherwise, it gives it that kind of like dissonant tone. So, like I've pulled this out in the past, but I've got like this little. So it's got a bell, and it sounds pretty good. That one actually sounds pretty good. But some bells and some other percussion instruments, when the harmonics aren't necessarily integer multiples of the fundamental, it sounds kind of like dissonant. It doesn't sound comfortable. When the harmonics are integer multiples of the fundamental, that's what gives us that like very consonant, very clean, very harmonic sound. When we have something where the harmonics are not integers multiples, it gives us something tonal, but it sounds dissonant. It sounds a little bit like maybe uncomfortable. It's not quite as comfortable with this thing. So what we want to try to do is what we're doing these a brass like manufacturer, they work really hard on flare, the amount of flare on the horn, and there's all these little tiny tricks that happen with the mouthpiece that make it so that all the harmonics squish in such a way that they're harmonically related, so they're integer multiples, and therefore gives you a pleasant sound. And it's crazy. You can go through and you can model all this stuff out. And nowadays with like big computers, we can actually predict this stuff. Back in the day, you had to do this empirically. You had to figure this out. And it was really, really hard to make an instrument from scratch. So you'd come up with a recipe after a lot of trial and error. It just blows my mind that that these early instrument developers were able to figure this stuff out. That they're able to figure out if I flare this thing out, it brings it brings the lower harmonics up, and then if I tweak the mouthpiece just so that it brings the upper harmonics down, so that they're basically integer multiples of the fundamental. It's crazy how they got this stuff to work. But the bell also does a lot of other stuff. It basically acts like it's an impedance matching tool, so it makes it loud, right? So if there's any brass players here, if you've ever like for me, I was a trombonist, and you can take the slide off and you can play the trombone without the bell. It's just the slide, and it's really quiet. It doesn't sound very good, and harmonically behaves very strange. And that's because it doesn't have the bell that allows it to really couple the sound to the air and get a lot louder right there. So with brass, one of the defining characteristics here is that changes in effective length are usually done with adding valves to the tubing. So with like a trumpet or tuba or French horn, or any of the other brass instruments, usually you're going to have some sort of valving system. Trombone, you actually like use your hand to go like that, and to actually add the tubing and reduce the tubing on there. But most of the other instruments, you're going to be pushing on valves to open up the different lengths of tubing that reroutes the sound to go through different lengths. And the longer the tube, the lower the frequency, the lower the resonant frequency of this thing. And so that's just kind of that's just something intuitive. The same thing with like strings. The longer the string, the lower the sound. So which is why like a bass guitar is going to have longer strings and heavier strings to lower the resonant frequency of it. Same thing with the tuba. So a tuba is going to be a very long instrument, and therefore it's a very, very large instrument as a result, compared to say something like a trumpet or like a smaller kind of brass instrument where it's going to be much smaller, and therefore it's going to have a lot like less tubing to go through, and therefore the frequency is going to be a lot higher. Interesting though, when you think about like something like the French horn. The French horn's a fairly large instrument, but you play at the higher modes of oscillation. And if you think about like how a French horn works, it's basically a very large instrument, but we put a tiny mouthpiece on there, so it forces into these upper modes of oscillation. We don't have time to go into all the kind of brass stuff, but it's really cool stuff. So let's talk about woodwinds for a second. So woodwinds, the reason we call them woodwinds, because they use reeds. So the reeds traditionally are always wood, and so you can use synthetic reeds nowadays, but still traditionally they're made of bamboo for the most part. The one thing that I always thought was kind of weird to me was like when I was like in whatever junior high band, I was sitting there like, why do they call it woodwinds? They're not even made of wood. Like you can think about a clarinet or an oboe or English horn or that they're made out of like these composite plastic materials these days. Like, why are they called woodwinds? You can get a woodwind, but for the most part, it's not the fact that they're made of wood. That's not that's not why they're called woodwinds. They're called woodwinds because they have a reed, and the reed is usually wood, except for the flute. The flute uses an air reed, so rather than a physical wooden reed, but it's still considered a woodwind. So, oh, nice. So yeah, you've got a wooden clarinet. That is cool. So, they're big pipes. They're actually, except for the flute, most of them are pipes closed at one end, but behave harmonically like a pipe open at both ends with all integer multiples of the fundamental. So the same thing is happening with the woodwinds as it is with the brass instruments. That by flaring by adding a flare or a conical shape to it, think about like a saxophone. So a saxophone, if you imagine a saxophone, even though it's got that iconic saxophone shape, if you were to stretch the thing out, it looks like a cone. And the reason that cone is there, the conical shape makes it behave like harmonically like a pipe open at both ends. So even though I've got my mouth on the saxophone mouthpiece and I'm blowing into it, it's harmonically going to act like a pipe open at both ends, which is kind of interesting. And but what's different, like one of kind of the defining differences between the woodwinds and the brass is that to change the effective length of the instrument to get different frequencies, you're going to have to, you basically open up holes in it in the same way that I have my little recorder or a flute or a clarinet or a saxophone. Basically, you're opening up the holes, and by opening up the holes, you're letting the air leak out, and therefore it's going to change the effective length of it. But what's interesting about like say, so like kind of going into our notion of like mic technique is, well, how do you mic a sax, right? Because by opening up a different pads on the saxophone to change the effective length, now you're letting the air leak out, and the air leaking out is going to carry a lot of the sound. And that it is interesting. If we think about like, saxophones on stage, for instance, that a lot of times we do a clip mic on the bell and point the microphone down into the bell. And that's because a lot of the sound does come out of the bell itself, but a lot of the sound is just emanating from the instrument overall. So when you want to mic, say a saxophone, you're not going to put a mic down into the bell. You're going to actually pull it away a little bit because the whole instrument is where the sound is coming from. It's kind of interesting how the radiation pattern off of an instrument, and in fact, you could might even change the angle at which we're miking the saxophone to see where the timbre changes are going to happen. Because, well, I mean, the openings are on different sides of the instrument. I guess I would say it's still probably straight on, but you're not going to stuff it down in there. And even if you're in the studio miking, say, a trumpet or something like that, you're not going to stuff a microphone down into the bell of the instrument. But you know that the sound is going to be coming directly off the bell of the instrument for brass instruments. So if you're recording a tuba, if you want to get the sound of a tuba, you could go over the top and into the bell a little bit, or you could pull back and it's going to give you a warmer sound, because the radiation pattern of a tuba is that low frequencies are going to emanate as a sphere, and the high frequencies are going to go up. We're going to talk about that next class with the fraction. It's pretty cool stuff. But it's good to just kind of think about the physics of the instrument and how you actually are going to mic these things. Oh, same thing on a violin. So if you're doing a violin, going back to the violin instrument, the radiation of the high frequencies are going to emanate off the front of the instrument, and then it's going to get mellower as you go down. So if you're doing this as a solo violin in a mix, if you want it to be brighter sounding, you go up over the top of the instrument. If you want it warmer, you bring it down on the side of the instrument. So you can tune it. And I'm a purist with my mic technique, like in that. Well, you'll hear that all the time, like through lots of different people, that you don't want to fix it in post. If you don't record it well, you're not going to get a good mix. You don't want to, rather than EQing it. So I guess what I'm saying here is, like, if I've got a violin and or let's do cello as an example. So I've got a cello and I'm going to be putting that in the mix of an ensemble, say, like in a rock ensemble, for instance. Like maybe I have it's just a cello that goes with a rock band. If I want it to cut through the mix, I'm going to go right up on the bridge. But if I want it to be mellower, I can go off the bridge, rather than trying to go, okay, I'm going to EQ this thing in post. EQ, I can roll off those high frequencies, but it's going to have that EQ'd sound to it. Whereas if I do good mic technique, I don't need to use any EQ. And so the idea is that by using good technique and by understanding the physics of these instruments and radiation patterns and mic technique is going to make it so that you don't really have to do anything in post. And that's kind of where we really want to go with this, is to get the Zen level where you just have to bring the faders up and they're all good. In real world, we have to do a lot of post and editing and all that kind of stuff. But that's the kind of idea that we're trying to do. Cool. All right. Yeah, totally. A polished shirt is still a turd. Yep. So the idea is that, and I learned a lot of this from my engineer, Matt, who taught me a lot of this stuff. Basically, he was a nut about mic technique. We would spend so long on mic technique and mic selection, because mic selection has a lot to do with this too. Like knowing the frequency patterns and the polar patterns and the feel of the mic, getting to know your mics really well will determine how the mic is going to pick up the instrument. So, cool. So let's talk about non-harmonic overtones for a minute. So when I was talking about these overtones, I wanted when I say harmonics, these harmonics are these integer multiples of the fundamental. It's going to give it a pleasing sound. And I don't have my headphones in. Somebody has their mic on, I think. Is that okay? I can't hear. I couldn't tell if it was like my computer talking back to me. But on non-harmonic overtones, what we mean by that is they're going to be these overtones, these harmonics that are going to be non-integer multiples of the fundamental. And where that's really going to show up is a lot in percussion instruments. So if we talk about, we call things like membranophones, idiophones. So membranophones are going to be like drums and cymbals. So when you hit a drum, you could say that, especially if you're a drummer, how you tune your, say, toms. you can kind of tune your toms to like a tonal like center. So if you want to tune them into like a G and an A or something like that, you can do that. But it's not a really strong sense of pitch. And depending on how like strong that is, or like we talk about something like a timpani. So a timpani can be tuned into a particular frequency. But if you hear the sound of a timpani has like, it's tonal, but it's not like super strong. It's got like that, like you hear a tone, but you hear a lot of like, it's not like a clean tone. It's got all these harmonics that are non-integer multiples. And then we talk about things like triangles and bells and even piano and vibrating bars. So idiophones are vibrating bars. And like, we're like, why is a piano involved in there? So I don't know why they put idiophones in there, but they are in there. So these are going to be like vibrating metal stuff. Although they talk about like marimbas. Like a marimba is like wooden bars. It doesn't have to be necessarily metal. But these are like surfaces, and these are like rods and bars and that kind of stuff. So, and I guess this is a surface, but yeah, bell's kind of it's got a weird one too. But a lot of these, like if you hear the sound of a triangle, you can say it's got a high pitch or a lower pitch, especially if I have multiple different triangles and I can ding them. But you don't really usually go, oh, that's an A or that's a G or that's an F sharp or something like that. You don't usually think about them in tones. They just kind of have a sound to them. Same thing with like cymbals, right? Like you could say that this cymbal is like pss, whoosh, pss, whoosh. They have these different tonal qualities to them of like higher pitch and lower pitch, but they're not tonal. And that's because, like in the case of these ones right here, they have so many harmonics that are non-integer multiples of the fundamental that it's sound, but it's not necessarily tonal. That there's no real sense of pitch. You can't really pull out the sense of tone on those things because there's so many harmonics going in there. So let's just talk about this again. This isn't really in the book, but I just want you, like, I think it's pretty interesting here. So if we look like a clamped bar versus a free bar. So like if you think about this one right here, this is our first mode of oscillation. This is our second mode of oscillation. This is our third mode of oscillation. And if we look at the multiples of this is F1, our first harmonic, our fundamental. Our second mode, if we look at the wavelength, it's actually 2.76 times F1. So this is not 2 times or 3 times, it's 2.76. And then our third mode of oscillation is 5.4 times the first mode. So we can see that these are all like going to be kind of wonky. And this one is F1, F2 is 6.27 and 17.55. So we can see that these are not integer multiples of the fundamental. So what we do a lot of times though with these, like if you think about like a marimba, for instance, or a glockenspiel, what we do is we suspend them right here, right at this spot right here, because we don't want to, like, we want them to vibrate freely. But what that's going to do is that's going to actually kill these other harmonics right here. And then in the case of like a marimba, we put a tube attached to it that has harmonic resonance. And so we try to force these bars and these rods to behave harmonically. So we pull a little bit of a sleight of hand, like some tricks to make these things vibrate in their modes of oscillation. Because if you just take a bar by itself, it's got a sense of tone, but it's fairly dissonant on its own. So we pull some tricks to actually like get these things to start behaving harmonically right there. Like, don't worry about any of these equations. All I wanted to show here was that the modes of oscillation are going to be such that they're non-integer multiples of the fundamental right there. So let's talk about drums. So drums have these different modes of oscillation. So like this is our first, like in fact, what you do is you call these membranes vibrate in kind of weird modes right here. And we don't call it this first mode, second mode, third mode, fourth mode. We call it the 0-1 mode or the 1-1 mode. So this one has one, it's like where the nodes, vibrational nodes are, where it's not moving. So when I say a vibrational node, it means it's not moving that point. Like it's like a string where the string was like in the middle of the string, it was not vibrating there. And so in this case, the plus just indicates phase or polarity. So it's pinched on the outside right here. So it's going up and down. The whole string, or sorry, the whole drum head is moving up and down. We call that the 0-1 mode because it's got zero of these like radial modes and one of these circumferential modes. And so this is the 1-1 mode where it's like basically the drum head is moving back and forth like this. If a drum head was, I don't think I have any drum heads in here. If I have a drum head right here that's moving back and forth like this, back and forth like this. And then this is a 2-1 mode because it has one in this direction right here. Or sorry, one there for the 2, and then one around the outside. This is where the outside, the center's moving up and the outside's moving down and moving, like, kind of think of it kind of going like that. So we call these different modes of oscillation. But the thing is to show here is that this is one If we normalize this as a frequency of 1, this is 1.59, 2.14, 2.3 times the fundamental, 2.65 times the fundamental, 2.92. So we can see that a lot of these, they're very close together and not harmonically related. And so therefore, if you hit, say, something like well, a snare drum you could, but let's hit a tom. So when you hit a tom, it's going to vibrate, but maybe you have one of these modes of oscillation, probably this one right here is going to ring out. And so that this one will tend to sustain quite a long time. So you get a sense of pitch kind of from this one, but all these are playing at the same time. So it's mostly just like a thwack, and it's got a tone to it. But what's interesting is if you take a tom, and like for all your drummers out there, if you like hit your tom in the middle and then hit your tom on the side, especially if you've got a bigger drum on, and hit it on the side over here, you'll see that you'll get a lot more tone if you hit it over here. This one's gonna give you a big thud. This one's going to give you a little bit more tone if you hit it right over here. And same thing if you're a timpaniist, this is where the tone for a timpani comes from. So a timpani's hit, like if you're playing a timpani, you don't hit it drum in the center, you hit it on the side because this is the one you want to really excite. If you hit a timpani in the center, you get a lot of this one and it's not a very like good sound. It's not actually the one you want. You want this one right here to give that quality of sound right there. So, but the point again, what we're saying here is that these are non-integer multiples of the fundamental. And so therefore it's going to give us non-tonal stuff. Let's talk about piano for a second. So pianos are interesting beasts. I love talking about pianos, and we can deconstruct them in a big, like, interesting fashion. But what we say is, like, if you know, the range of a piano is massive, and the way we get a massive range of piano is that we have really, really thick strings that are really long down in the low registers, and at the high one we have these really small, thin, tight strings. So what we want is we want our strings to be really tight, because that's what's really going to give us a lot of long sustain and good volume. So as a result, if I want, like we call it again Mersen's law. So if I want to make a sound, a string vibrate at low frequencies, I can either add mass to it, I can loosen it, or I can lengthen it. So in the case, or a combination of those. Well, I can't make the piano string too loose because I need it to be tight so that it can be nice and loud. So if I'm going to make this piano string tight, that means I need to make it really long and really heavy. And the way I make it really heavy is by making it really, really thick. Now, the problem is by making something, a string really thick, is that it's going to start to act like a rod, which is why on piano or like guitar strings and most string instruments, we have wrap strings. So you can hear me, my string, that what we have is we have a core of thin strings and then we wrap thick strings around it. And what that does, it allows it to have a lot of mass, but retain its flexibility. And if we think about piano strings, they're really, really heavy. But the problem is, even still, as we start to add a lot of mass and make them really thick, they behave kind of like rods. So what the result is, at low frequencies, at low harmonics, they're like really flexible. But as the wavelength gets shorter, they start to get relatively stiffer. And so the result is that the harmonics get pushed up and they're actually out of tune with one another. And the crazy thing with that is that the result is that when you tune a piano, if you've ever seen anybody tune a piano, what they do is they listen for beat frequencies in the harmonics. So when we like beat frequencies, meaning this. So like if I'm tuning a guitar, like I would, that's actually pretty close tune. So if I tune this one out of tune, hear that wah wah wah. So the closer they get in tune with that beat, it's called a beat frequency, and it's where they're getting constructed. They're going in and out of phase with one another. What piano tuners do is they listen for the beat frequency in the harmonics. And what ended up happening there was I was saying that basically the harmonics are out of tune. So if I have a low frequency, like the fundamental of, let's say, a low string, the fundamental of a string, that the harmonics are going to actually drive a little bit sharp. And therefore, if I'm tuning the next string up relative to that against that beat frequency of those harmonics, it's going to push that high frequency or that next key to be just a little bit sharp. So, and the result is what we get, what's called piano tuning. And if you go up the piano, it gets more sharp, and if you go down on the piano, it gets more flat. So if you hit like a G on the high register and the G on the low register, they're pretty far out of tune from one another. And that's again as a result of the fact that these strings are starting to behave kind of like rods at the upper harmonics there. It's kind of weird. It's kind of cool. But we can make pianos perfectly, well, I won't say perfectly in tune, because there is no such thing as perfectly in tune. But if we do something what we call like the equal tempered scale, like a keyboard, like the modern tuning that we use in the Western world, it's called equal tempered. And it's basically the gap between each note is exactly the same. It's 1.05946. So each note is 6% higher than the previous one. We can tune pianos to be in equal tempered, but because that the piano is such an older instrument that we're used to hearing it, that it sounds weird to our ear to have a piano that's perfectly equal tempered. It just doesn't work right, especially for all you pianists out there. It just doesn't feel right, like when you're actually doing that. So it's kind of strange. So it's just a very strange thing. So we just deal with that as part of pianos being kind of out of tune on the very high. It's pretty close in the middle register, but when you get really high and really far down, if you're playing on these out here, it's actually a little dissonant, and you can hear it. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, the overtones are slightly sharp, so it causes a little mistuning. So it's called stretch tuning or piano tuning. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And so if you've got really good, like if you're using, say, a MIDI keyboard and you're using a MIDI piano synthesizer, like a good one, like say you're using something like Kontakt or some fancy grand piano sampled thing, it's going to have all this tunings like built into it. So you can choose equal tempered. But if you keep an equal tempered piano, it has a kind of a synthetic sound to it. It just doesn't sound natural. It sounds weird. You're like, yeah, it's in tune, but something that makes your face scrunch a little bit. It's just like unnatural sounding. So you usually want to find a piano sampling library that's going to have actual samples of an actual stretch. Instead of taking one sample and stretching it too far out, you're going to actually multi-sample this thing so that you're sampling all these highs and lows so they actually get stretched out there. Pretty interesting stuff. So cool. Yeah. All right. So let's get back to the kind of program. So I went off on a little side tangent there though, because I think this stuff is just fascinating when you talk about like how music instruments work. But let's talk about like the dynamic range. So kind of like in line with we're talking about in terms of the kind of what, going back to the core of the book. So when we talk about the dynamic range of speech and music, what we want to see is that, or what we kind of notice is that when we talk about voice, or first we talked about human hearing, so with perception, and we saw that with the Fletcher-Munson curves, that we're really sensitive and about to be, say, between the 2 and the 5K range right there. And that's a result of this pipe. We have a pipe closed at one end. Our ear canal is a pipe closed at one end, and therefore it resonates just like a clarinet or just like a acoustic guitar or any of these. It has a specific resonance, and as a result, we're very sensitive at those frequencies. And it just so happens, not coincidentally, that our voice is going to take up a lot of the same region. So if we look at let's talk about the dynamic range first. So the typical dynamic range of voice is between 30 and 40 dB, and so it can be as high as 60 or 70 dB. So ding, ding, ding. Whenever I say like decibels, again, what I want you to think about with decibels is, what is it comparing? Well, the dynamic range is the quieter to the louder sound. So when there's no SPL, what we're doing here is we're saying the range of something is going to be the quiet to the loud sound. It's going to be 30 to 40 dB right there, or maybe up to 60, 70. So in old days, analog equipment right here, like the old timey radios and vinyl, and that sort of like old school mics, and even like crappy old mics, they didn't even have very good, the first mics, like, you think about like in the 40s, well, I mean, mics have been around before that, but we think about something like starting around maybe the 30s, like we started thinking about the 30s, like, I don't know if you saw, I just saw Oh Brother, Where Art Thou recently, right? Awesome movie. I haven't watched it in a long time, and I forgot how good a movie that really is. And they're in the studio and they're singing into like the old school microphones, like in the 30s, like these old, like tinny kind of like really low dynamic range microphones. The old school dynamic range microphones, they peak out because they have such small dynamic range. They clip very, very easy. And so when you think about like listen to some of the early like radio broadcasts, or like Roosevelt's fireside chats and those kind of things, you listen to those, they have a really harsh clipping distortion to them. And we're going to talk about distortion here in just a couple minutes. but that's because the mics themselves don't have a lot of dynamic range. Our modern microphones have a lot of dynamic range, say on the upwards of say 120 dB, which correlates to the human hearing. So we can actually have a lot of dynamic range with our current microphones, and therefore they won't clip very much internally. They just don't overblow. But like in the old school days, like when we think about the 30s and the 40s, I mean, you think about the sound of a 40s microphone, like a movie, like think about like old school, like black and white movies, that they have this kind of fuzziness like clip to them because those microphones do clip. But still, like listen to some of the jazz recordings from that era and like done well, they're amazing. Like some of those early jazz recordings are still like really good recordings. But you know, they still do tend to clip out a little bit there. And as we get into like the 50s and the 60s, right around the 60s is when we started getting really good with mics and make the dynamic range of microphones started getting really good. But so again, here 30 and 40 dB for spoken voice right there. And then we think about music. So music can be as dynamic as 100 dB for an orchestra. So that's one of the things we like about classical music is that it's really loud and really quiet and really loud and really quiet. They use dynamics very much as part of the emotional tool. Whereas if you think about something like, say, a rock band, and rock band does have a dynamics, but not nearly as much as, say, something that we'd have in say, an orchestra or like classical type settings here. So analog broadcasting mediums had a hard time with this range. And so so that's where we started using compressors and for broadcast, because the dynamic range of like true classical music is so wide that you're basically jumping for your volume now. Listening to classical in the car is really tough because the quiets are so quiet. You turn up the volume knob in your car because the road noise is there, and then all of a sudden they get into a really loud section. You turn it down, and you can't hear it anymore. And you have to turn it back up. So and in broadcast, most stuff is going to be compressed. They're reducing the dynamic range so that it's like not as annoying. But for true audiophiles, you want to get the original stuff that's got the full dynamic range on there. So let's talk about digital dynamic range. So analog has a hard time with this stuff, but digital, what we're going to say is we have 6 dB of range per bit. Or sorry, 6 dB of dynamic range. That's supposed to say dynamic. 6 dB. So this is something I do want you to remember. It's actually 6.02 dB of dynamic range because if you're like 6.02, that's kind of a number I might have remembered when we were doing decibel stuff. In terms of voltage, 6.02 is twice the gain. So when we're doing this in digital domain, each bit is gonna double the dynamic range. So it's gonna double the dynamic range right there. No, sorry, not double the dynamic range. Doubles the gain, but results in a 6 dB dynamic increase there. So because 6 dB in voltage is double, right? So double is 6 dB is double. So each time I add another bit on our digital word, it's going to double the dynamic range, but which turns out to be 6 decibels. So you guys probably went through or have gone through a fair amount of PCM, pulse code modulation. That's how we record most modern digital stuff. So actually I can show that here. Like, so I think can I show my range in, let's go back over here. So if I look at this 24-bit range right here and my 16-bit range right here, you can see, well, 16-bit, it's hard to read right here, but it's 32,000, was it 30,676 and to negative 32,676. So 65,656, like different height, different range. That's how many bits I have to code for right here is 2 to the 16 in this case. So over here, so doubling equals 6 dB in voltage right there. So let's take a look at this table right here. So 6 dB, so 4 bits. So 4-bit has a dynamic range because 4 times 6 is 24. So 8-bit, so like we think about old 8-bit systems, 8-bit, like, you know, the whole 8-bit audio movement, 8 times 6 is 6 times 8 is 48. So I have 48 decibels of dynamic range. And what that means is that the fuzz, the noise is going to be at the bottom, and then the signal can go up to be 48 decibels louder than that. So this would work pretty well for, like we were saying, spoken word. Spoken word sounds pretty good. But if we want to start doing music stuff, it needs to be much higher than that. So that's when we got to like 12-bit, which we don't really use that much, I would say, in audio. Mostly we were going to start around 16-bit, so CD quality audio. 16-bit is going to, 16 times 6 is going to be 96. So that means a CD has 96 decibels of dynamic range. That's pretty good. It's not quite as much as, say, like the best orchestra, but it does pretty good for most stuff. Like, so 96 decibels is like pretty good. When we jump up to 24-bit, we get 144 dB of dynamic range. So this is why you should always be recording in 24-bit. At deliver, we tend to deliver at 16-bit, but we record at 24-bit. That's because it allows you to use tons of dynamic range in there. 144 dB is larger than the dynamic range of the human hearing system, and actually larger than any analog gear. So like all of a sudden, or like when I say analog gear, I mean like the DA converters and AD converters on your system. So therefore, 24-bit is pretty stinking awesome, which is why we haven't seen much push to go beyond that. We have 32-bit and 32-bit float point, but 32-bit float point is pretty cool. We don't have time to go into float and fixed point for today, but it's worth looking into and understanding what that is. 30, like more bits isn't necessarily better. So 24 bits is pretty stinking awesome for most stuff. Because above this, you hit the limits of your A to D conversion. Our A to D converters are the best ones are about 104, 110 dB dynamic range. So there's no benefit to going higher bit depth than that. It's just eating up data for no reason. So pretty interesting stuff there. Cool. So let's take a look at this auditory area of speech and music. So this correlates back to what we were just talking about. So this is that 30 to 40 dB of dynamic range right here. And this is like our voice range right here. So our voice range is usually going to be around, I'd say 100 to like, when they say 4,000 hertz, it goes up a little higher than that. But this is generally where the speech is region right here. And this is, so between these dotted lines, this is the threshold of pain. This is the threshold of hearing. So speech sits smack in the middle of our hearing. So we can see very clearly in this plot right here that our speech and our hearing system are very well correlated. So that our speech like is smack in the middle of all of our hearing. So where we're the most sensitive, and also where like in the range where like it would make sense for us to be able to speak. Because if this speech was this little like jelly bean looking thing was actually, if it was like pushed down here, that means like there would be a mismatch between when we speak and when we can hear. So kind of interesting stuff there though. I think that like, so we're starting to tie in a lot of this physiology, and then also like, yeah, I guess we're tying together different aspects of physiology, our speaking system and our hearing system right there. And our like this notion of dynamic range. So, but here's where we do music. So music tends to push out a lot higher. So we have 70, in this case, 75 dB, although they can be up to 100 dB. And then we're going to go from 50 to 800, 8,500. But we know that like, we also tend to like stuff really bassy, right? So like if you're at a club, the real big kick from a club is going to be between 40 and 60 hertz. Yeah, actually 50 is probably pretty good right there. So this is going to be the big thumpy stuff down here. That's going to be like where we get that oomph, oomph, oomph. But we're also going to go pretty high up to like 8,500 hertz. We have sounds that go much higher than that. And actually, I'm curious, like on this one right here on the spectrogram, like it's hard to read it. This thing's off the thing, but this is, well, let's turn up the gain on this thing. Yeah, I can't really see it, but if I was doing my voice and stuff, you'd see that there's actually stuff way up. This is about 16K, so this is 20K or 20K right here. And then, I guess I'm recording. What was I recording at? I was only recording at 48K. So that this is going to go up to 24 kilohertz up here. So there's going to be stuff, there's going to be sound that happens up in the upper regions, well above above this region right here. So even though I could say like I can hear up to 10,000 hertz, I can hear twice 10,000 hertz. So going from 10K to 20K, but that 10K to 20K, it's important, but it's not that important. Like when we start getting to ear training and critical listening next semester, Like we'll start listening to like 16K, it's way up there. And you're like, man, if I can't really hear it, is 16K really that musically important? And the answer is probably not that much. If you're missing the 16K and you have it rolled off, you're probably gonna be just fine and save a lot of data to boot, which is a big deal with like when you're doing like perceptual coding in programs. Like most of the time, you can't tell if there's anything above 16K, which is funny to me because when you think like I work in the audiophile like industry a lot, and you get these people who are like they believe that they can hear sounds above like they believe these super tweeters like that'll go up to like 24K and 30K kilohertz. First off, none of your mics record up that high. Second, like knowing what we know about hearing loss, that especially as you get older, your hearing loss drops quickly at the high frequencies. And I always think it's hilarious because it's a bunch of old dudes at these audiophile conferences that are like trying to like sit there. They're like, yeah, sounds a little dull above 16K. You're like, dude, you can't hear 16K. I can barely hear 16K. So like, but it's funny to hear all that stuff. So again, once you're empowered with all this like this like science and music understanding, it really is empowering when you go to these like conferences and understand this stuff. So, all right. We've got a few more minutes here. So I know I'm blasting through these topics here, but I think this stuff is really cool. Let's talk about this idea on noise. So this is one like a big area of misunderstanding for us a lot of times in the industry. So what we call signals and noise. So signals usually imply conveyance of information. So that's what we want. And then the noise is going to be the usually unwanted sound. So when we talk about things like signal to noise ratios, the signal is going to be like the information and the noise is going to be the non-information. And so we can measure the non-information to the information and the non-information. And so you hear that term used quite a bit. In fact, I run my artist collective. It's called Signal Noise Media Labs. And that's because it's got a double entendre there. Of course, because part of it's because I teach this stuff all the time. But second is because you're like, oh yeah, it's cool. It's like the important versus the non-important. It's like got this kind of like cool like double entendre, like significance that goes along with it. But they're both like they both have their uses. Like we use noise for a lot of things here. Like we want to actually use for testing purposes, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So the evaluation of noise is subjective. So when we sit there and we talk about like how loud a room is or what's going on there, like what's going on with the noise in the room. Like generally speaking, what we're trying to do as acousticians is we're trying to lower the noise floor. And the way we lower the noise floor is by isolation. So we're getting rid of the road sounds from outside and like air conditioner sounds and people sounds. So we're going to do some absorption. This is where we're going to start transitioning after today. We're going to start transitioning into this, like the idea of acoustics, of room acoustics. And so things get kind of cool. And so we start to walk into rooms and start thinking about things a little bit different. But so the evaluation of noise is subjective. High frequencies are more annoying than low. I just did this. Actually, maybe I'll talk about. I don't have time to talk about it now, but I just did this whole thing on. I got called in to do this noise evaluation for the Four Seasons up in Vail, and basically they were buying. They were selling this unit for $6.5 million. It's crazy expensive, and this group was going to buy this thing, but the prospective buyer came in, slept in the unit for one night, and came to the realtor, goes, that's unacceptable. There's all this noise. I can't sleep in this room, especially for $6.5 million apartment. It should be pretty quiet, at the Four Seasons. So the realtor calls in and goes, I don't know what you're hearing. So they called me in. They're like, hey, can you come in and identify this noise and figure out what's going on here? I walk in and in 5 minutes, I'm like, oh, I already got it. Figured out what's going on here. They're like, what's funny is that the realtor didn't have like a trained ear. I was like, oh yeah, I can hear it. It sounds like pipes. It sounds like water running through pipes. And turns out it was the steam pipes running through the walls. But bizarrely, I mean, to me, it was like wildly annoying, and I couldn't stand it. I was like, oh, I would be so mad if I was buying this place. I can't do it. So my job was to go figure out how to fix it, and we went down in the steam rooms and had to do all these isolation mounts and all this kind of stuff. Like, it was really not all that complicated. But what's interesting though was the fact that this hissing, and I put up the microphone to record it so I could show them, because a lot of times like people couldn't hear it, but to me it was super annoying because it was right in around the 5K to 8K range, which is like this hiss. It's going noise. Like, and you're like, oh man, it's so annoying. And yeah, you can have these like rumbles. And if you have like a low frequency rumble, say like an HVAC system, or like if something's on the ceiling and cycling, it's going woo, 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 woo. You can hear it, but it's not usually all that annoying. It's the high frequency stuff that's really annoying. So usually we want to spend our time mitigating and making sure that we take care of those high frequency stuff. And yeah, intermittent is way more annoying than constant. So I set up my microphone and I recorded for a full 24 hours in this room at 96 kilohertz at 24 bit. And you can watch it over the period. It's cool to watch a 24-hour audio file, a spectrogram of it, and you can see the systems turning on and off. And then what I did is I did some forensics and went back and you match it to the cycle. I went to engineering and go, hey, can you show me the cycling, the history of this going on, the steam system going on and off? And I could show that, yep, this is the steam system, because I could see that it turned on at 6 a.m. And I show on my plot, it was at 6 a.m. that you could see this spike in noise. And it was really cool. It was a lot of fun. So, I mean, a lot of fun for me because it was like it wasn't my money, but for other people, they're like, oh man, Four Seasons needs to spend a lot more money to fix this place up. Yeah, it can range from annoying to dangerous. So let's talk about this idea. So we use pink noise and white noise a lot for measurements. So why do we use noise for measurement? When we want to measure the room, a lot of times if you've been around like setting up for a live show or something like that, they'll oftentimes blast some noise out of the speakers. And the reason is they're trying to get a broad range of frequencies. Because if I just do something like a single sine wave, sine waves, they're so narrow, they can be easily influenced. So if I were to do, say, like a 1 kilohertz sine wave and I put up a measurement microphone, when I move that microphone around, it's going to, the measurements are going to vary greatly. Whereas if I use noise, because it's going to swamp out any of these like micro weirdnesses that happen at any particular frequencies. So we use noise when we're doing acoustic measurements. But typically what we're going to do, oops, I don't know if I said it in there, but usually what we do is if we're doing electronic measurement, we use sine waves. And if we're doing acoustic measurements, we're going to use noise. So we use sine for electrical measurements and we use noise for acoustic measurements, because for noise, it swamps out any of those weirdnesses there. So when we talk about noise, what we're doing, this is kind of just like a distribution of how they create this noise. So it shows up in all analog circuits. In fact, just having a capacitor, not a capacitor, a resistor creates noise. So, and it's really difficult to keep the noise down in any analog system. So like that's where the art of that's what you're paying for when you buy an expensive mic pre, is like these engineers know like what components and what orientation and what configuration can make these things nice and quiet. So so it's chaotic. So basically what we say is if we want to create noise, we're going to play all the frequencies at the same time. So, and as a result is like, well, okay, I'll demonstrate this here in a second. So we're going to talk about this thing we call white noise. So white noise is equal energy per frequency. So it correlates to white light. So when we talk about white light is all the frequency, all the visible frequencies that we can see playing at the same time, at the same amplitude. And the result is we get white light. So if we have something like pink light, so pink light is going to be something that has more low frequencies than high frequencies. And the result is we get something that looks pink. And so we call that pink noise. And so pink noise is equal energy per octave. So white noise is equal energy per frequency. Pink noise is equal energy per octave. So it correlates to pink light. And it has a -3 dB per octave slope. But because we hear on an octave system, it sounds flat to our ears, or relatively flat. So this is what we tend to use. So for most acoustic measurements, we use pink noise because to our ears, that's flat. Because this one is going to sound fairly bright, and this one's going to sound fairly even sounding right there. So the result is right here. So don't look at the B here. That's really confusing. This is out of the book. So white noise is flat, and pink noise is distributed down here, but it sounds equal. So what I'm showing here is that if I look at this, at every single frequency, it's going to have the same amplitude. But on this one right here, so between 1 kilohertz and 2 kilohertz, if I sum up the energy under this curve right here, and I go from 2 to 4 kilohertz, it's going to have, and I add up the energy under this one, like on an octave system, it's going to have the same amount of energy between 2 and 4 kilohertz as I do between 1 and 3 kilohertz as the energy there. So what we're saying there is that it's equal energy per octave under that system. So the result is, and I'll just play it real quick. If I wanted to create this, we use, actually, let me see. Do I have anything else? Do I have any more slides? I think that's it. Oh, distortion. I didn't get to distortion. I got a whole section. So we'll talk about harmonic distortion next class, but actually I'm gonna do so. I'll hit up this idea on pink noise and white noise. I'll do some demos on that, and I also want to talk about distortion because I think distortion is really interesting because we're gonna use sine waves to measure distortion, and that's something that it becomes very apparent. We're gonna do a lot more of this when we get into critical listening. What does distortion sound like? We have good distortion, we have bad distortion, we have good noise, and we have bad noise. So it's interesting to think about what we have going on there. So. Anyway, it's 12:15 right now, so I'm gonna stick around for any questions right now, but I'm gonna stop the recording. But